The most important part to any zoo is the animals in the enclosures they call home. Throughout the series, I'll be designing different enclosures for an array of animals, whilst also keeping guest interaction at the forefront of every build. Join me each week as I tackle a new enclosure and idea and try and bring it to life within Planet Zoo. Today I decided to build a walkthrough enclosure and I chose everybody's favourite animal, the ring-tailed lemur. My idea was to have a main island and then smaller patches of land for the lemurs to walk over the guests and access more of their enclosure. Here are the stats for the lemurs, and climbing requirement is very important as well as land, and something else to bear in mind is the boundary and making sure it isn't climbable. The social structures for lemurs is very important, and as you can see they can be in very large groups with only one male up to 29 females. Starting off today's build, I wanted to crack on with the lemur house, which you'll be able to view from the footpath outside the enclosure. So I wanted to make sure there was a big bay window for guests to be able to see right through, so when the lemurs are sleeping you can see them perfectly without even going in the enclosure. At this point I wanted to crack on with the footpath and sort of lay out where I wanted my main island to be. To do that I needed to crack on with the moat, so here I am just sort of laying out where I want the water to be, and there is bits that will cut through under the footpath because I wanted bridges so that guests feel like they're right in on the action. With the water in, it was time to crack on with the boundaries and making sure this was a nice large enclosure because I wanted to use up as much of the space as possible, as this is sitting behind the flamingo enclosure as well as a keeper area. Here I'm just remembering that I need the guest gates to make the walkthrough, so I'm just trying to line them up perfectly and I get them in there. This is the first time they're being used in this series, so it's quite exciting. At the moment I am using this log paneling, but I later changed this to a chain link fence so that I can use the tool that sits on top of the fence so that the lemurs can't climb, which you can see there on the screen now. This was a bit of a tedious process, but I got there eventually and I was round to the other side of the walkthrough, and this is where I'm adding the second gate so that guests can access it from both sides. Here I am just fiddling around with the fence trying to get it to the right level so it matches the whole thing. I did consider changing the fence so that you couldn't see through, but that wouldn't work with the climbable, so I added this log paneling all the way around instead. With most of the fencing in place, it was now time to add the window. I just used the glass barriers, no one-way glass with this. I just wanted to keep it nice and simple, and this worked out pretty well because I tried this process a couple of times, and it always works, and obviously it provides that nice big bay window that you can see there. With the barrier complete, I was admiring my work, and that's when I realised I'd not placed a keeper gate. So this is where the fun began, trying to work out where to put it. I tried several different locations, and I eventually realised it'd have to go in where the bay window is, because they'd need to access the house. With my bay window looking smaller than I would have liked, it was time to get the lemur in and start placing enrichment as well as foliage, really trying to fill in the space that I had. The lemur is in, and this is where I started getting the ground right, but for some reason the game wasn't registering the lemur being there a few times, so I had to sort of keep trying again and again, and this was quite a long process. I'd sort of got the levels right between soil and grass, and then it wasn't really happy, and then I was fiddling around with other things, and it took a long time to sort of get the right texture. Content with how the ground was looking, I thought it was time to get some climbable objects in there, and I wanted to make sure there was loads dotted around the enclosure because I wanted the lemurs to be at different heights for everyone to see and really sort of get the best view of the lemurs when walking through the enclosure. And I did sort of look at this big walkway, but it wasn't going to happen, so I chose these slightly smaller ones and placed them over the water. I wanted to make sure that guests were right in on the action, so I also placed a second walkway right over the guest bridge, so that the lemurs could get really close and access the other parts of the island. With lots of climbing apparatus around the island, I wanted to make sure there was some within the house, so I moved on into there. But at first, I placed this forage enrichment thing, so that the lemurs had something to do when in the house. But I also wanted to make sure there was plenty of viewing of the lemurs close to the windows. I wanted the lemurs to use as much of the climbing space as possible, so I tried to place plenty of bedding on these equipment so that they would go up there and use the space. Here I'm placing loads of enrichment and just more climbable things for the lemurs to use. Enough climbing equipment, it was time to add some foliage and plants. So I started with these palm trees and then these smaller banana trees and sort of placed them in a similar formation around the enclosure. I also stumbled across these really interesting big leaf plants here. There was some slightly bigger ones, but they were too big for the enclosure, so I dotted them around as they really filled in the space nicely. With the plants in, it was my next favourite thing, rock work, which I focused on the main island to start with this mossy rock type, and then filled it in with some different coloured rocks there just to add different gradients to the edge of the main island. With the build nearing completion, it was just time to do the final few touches, which one of those things was adding this fencing around parts of the island that guests and lemurs could kind of mix. I done this so that the lemurs couldn't walk onto the footpath that guests use and vice versa, guests walking out onto the enclosure. Overall, I'm really pleased with this build. It went much better than the last one, but my only issue is that the walkway itself, when you look at it from above, it looks quite empty. So maybe if I was ever to come back to this enclosure, I would look at maybe putting some covers over so that the guests feel more enclosed, and just so it doesn't look as bare from above. But for my first walkthrough enclosure, I'm really happy with the result, even if those changes could be made in the future.